Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 3. We are talking about research ethics today, and I know that you're already really excited because those are two words that you really love, that you always are surrounded by excitement, right? Ethics, research, very fun. But how about this? This video is probably going to be about an hour long. There's a lot of content to cover. If you stay until the end, I will show you my dog. I'll show you my dog Teddy. He hasn't been on camera before in this class. In Chapter 1, you saw one dog. I don't remember which one it was. In Chapter 2, you saw the other one. Now you're going to see the oldest, if you wait till the end. Let's go. So this chapter, I'm breaking it into two separate ideas. The one at the end, I'll start here, in the second half of this video, is going to cover ethics in research. So we're going to be talking about all the different kinds of ways that we have to protect research from being unethical and from taking advantage of participants and things like that. So that's at the second half of this video, and Chapter 3 in your textbook is almost all just this, ethics in research. The reading research, I wanted to do this because this is the first the first chapter where we're kind of like getting into research articles and reading them ourselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and why it's important, and kind of some tips and tricks on how to get through them, because for almost everybody in this class, this is not easy. Reading research is not an easy thing to do. It doesn't come naturally. So I wanted to spend some time talking about it before we get there. The video that I have for you in this video, if you choose to watch it, this is not like a mandatory video to watch. It's just kind of an interesting one. That is the 5 psychology experiments you couldn't do today. It's hosted or presented by, I think it's Hank Green. It could be Chris Green. I can't tell the difference between those two brothers, actually. I know they're authors or whatever, and that they do the Crash Course YouTube series. So if you've ever Googled, any question about American history or chemistry or statistics into YouTube, you're probably going to get a video with one of their faces in it. All right, so I wanted to start out here by talking about sources of information. So this kind of harks back to Chapter 1, and I know I'm being a little bit unfair here, but I'll tell you why in a second. So here we have kind of two separate sources. We have somebody on Twitter who is very popular. We have Kylie Jenner here on the left, and we have Dr. Paul over here on the right. Let's say that Miss Jenner sends this tweet. Let's ask ourselves, why did I see 75 planes spraying white stuff into the sky on my 15-minute drive to work? Who pays for this, and why is it happening? Is something being so on and so forth? Basically, what she's asking about is, what are all these white trails in the sky that seem to be following planes? Could they be chemicals that are used to harm the populace, like as an elaborate conspiracy? This is something that is called chemtrails. It's a very popular conspiracy, been popular since I was growing up. But so let's say somebody popular shares that on Twitter, and that idea is going to be spread around a lot. People are going to engage with it. They're going to read it. They're going to maybe think about it, maybe not, but that idea gets out there. So that's one source of information. The other source of information, Dr. Paul, you ask Dr. Paul about these chemtrails, and he's kind of a boring guy. He's not really that funny or that cool, because most scientists aren't. Most scientists are very analytically minded people. And I say that as I consider myself a scientist, so I'm not trying to diss anybody. I'm not trying to clap back anybody. All my friends are scientists. We are not cool people. We are not fun on Twitter or on TikTok or whatever. Maybe a couple of people, but for the most part, they're not so much. And he tells me that chemtrails are just water vapor. So Kylie wants me to, Kylie wants me to read this and to try to connect the dots, to try to raise questions, to try to get a conversation started about these chemtrails that could be harmful in our sky up above. Paul, on the other hand, he's going to give me a long and boring explanation that ultimately just kind of says, oh, that's fine, it's not anything to worry about. So who should I trust here? Now, obviously, everybody watching this video knows that I should trust this guy over here, right? That I should trust Dr. Paul. Why? Because he's a scientist, and because we know, or at least we're taught growing up, that scientists are a good source of information. And we also know that celebrities and influencers are not super reliable, and that, that I don't know, we know to treat information we see on the internet very suspectly. However, y'all know that a lot of people will be affected by this message here on the left, and not that many people are going to be affected by this over here on the right. Or if they even seek that out, right? Because who's going to hear an explanation if they don't search for it? So this is all just to, to kind of have us thinking about where we're getting information and why it's important. The hard route, it's always the hardest route to get information, is usually the most reliable, which is that you should, read literature about it, and that you should look at evidence and make a decision for yourself. Whenever you see these kinds of memes shared on Twitter or on TikTok or whatever, these kinds of kind of conspiratorial things, people will always tell you, think for yourself, and ask questions about it. But usually, if I Google, are chemtrails harmful, I'm probably going to get a bunch of hits and a bunch of sites about, created by conspiracy theorists, which is, as we talked about, confirmation bias, back in chapter 1. Okay, so just to take a very quick break here, something that I thought was kind of funny, or maybe kind of sad, I don't know. Before making this, I had a break in Research Methods 1 where I hadn't taught it in a couple of years, and so I was revisiting these slides, and it was actually about vaccines, and it had Jenny McCarthy, who, as y'all know, is she's one of the celebrity judges on The Masked Singer or whatever, but she was very anti-vax. But this was before COVID, so it was before anti-vax was kind of like a kind of trendy political issue. I didn't include that slide or that example here because I feel like vaccines have become a political thing, which is a little ridiculous. But the idea still stands that typically most people are going to get their information from sources of entertainment, not of these more kind of boring sources that are often, accurate, but maybe not as engaging, maybe not as compelling. So that's just to get us thinking about these questions about where we get the information that we receive. Where do we get it? Where do we learn from it? Or where do we learn it from? And you may remember in chapter 1, I talked about how journal articles are, kind of like the best way to find information. However, they're really boring, and they're usually long, and they have way more detail and way more jargon than any, public consumer usually wants. And so we gravitate towards these kinds of memes that are just shared by random people online. All right, so this is another one of those slides that didn't age so well. So whenever I was but I kept it in, as you'll see, because I'm trying to make a point about something. But I'm not trying to make a political point. This guy ran for Senate in Pennsylvania, and before any of that happened, I had him as an example of an unreliable authority figure. Anyways, most people know this guy as Dr. Oz. He became prominent, and if you don't know him, I guarantee your parents do. But you know him probably because he was on Oprah's daytime TV show for a very, very long time as kind of her kind of go-to medical expert. And then he was so popular, he kind of spun off into his own show that aired during the daytime, his talk show that was health and wellness minded, and he would talk about all these different kinds of medicines and stuff like that. It was a very optimistic, warm show. It was not meant to be divisive or anything like that. So, where do we get our information from? I just told you that maybe we should think about listening to Dr. Paul, this guy over here, right? This guy that's kind of boring. But this guy's a doctor too, right? So maybe we should listen to him. So this is why, if you think about this flow chart right here, if we are listening to authorities, then we have to be careful because authorities may get their own info from research, or it could be from their own personal experience, or it could be from their own kind of gut instincts. Now, this can be a little bit dangerous, right? Because if an authority figure is spreading information, from their own personal experience, it has the illusion of coming from their own independent research, when in fact it doesn't. Which brings us to this example right here about green coffee extract. So a number of years ago, he promoted this and was saying, you may think magic is make-believe, but this little bean has scientists saying they found the weight loss cure for everybody type. Alright, so green coffee extract, that all sounds great, and it's coming from an authority figure. Do you think he did that research himself? No, he didn't. He's a talk show host now. He was getting this from either somebody else, or maybe somebody paid for him to talk about it. Either way, let's say, I was interested in this, so I checked out, the research. I looked at the literature. Oh, this is great. Randomized double-blind placebo-controlled linear dose crossover study to evaluate the efficacy and safety of a green coffee bean extract in overweight subjects. That is a very long title, and you can see there's lots of really great buzzwords here, which are good research methods. Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, linear dose, crossover studies. Those are all words that usually suggest good, strict research methods. However, if you go try to find that article now, you'll see that as of 2014, so even a long time ago, that this study was retracted. It was retracted. Why? Because the people who made the study cannot assure the validity of the data, so we are retracting the paper. So the people who made this study can no longer say, oh, actually, we're not sure that if it's valid. And so it's been retracted. But do you think that a talk show host is going to, again, go on national TV and say, hey, remember that thing I talked about a couple of years ago? Turns out it was all bogus and didn't actually work. I'm so sorry for promoting that. Maybe he does. But do you think that that information is going to reach as wide an audience? Is that information engaging? No, you're telling somebody that a miracle cure doesn't really work. That's not going to be as newsworthy, and it's not going to spread as much as the correction. So this is all me trying to emphasize that maybe these articles right here are the best places to get information. That we can look at these articles. If I tried to find that claim about the green coffee extract, I'd find that it was bogus. I'd find that it was retracted, right? So the best place for us to get research generally is going to be consulting the research and looking at it. However, being realistic, not everybody has time for that. Not everybody has expertise for that. But you, yes, you who are graduating within the field of psychology, whether you're a minor or a major, you are going to be an expert in psychology. So it behooves you to be able to read this stuff and to understand it in your own personal life, let alone in your own work life. All right, let's get into it. So let's say that we consult scientific resources. This is the best way to generally go about doing it, is through peer-reviewed journal articles. Most journal articles are going to be published anywhere between twice a year to 12 times a year, so monthly, and they're usually written with the scientist in mind. So they're not written for a public audience, which is, I don't know, maybe a really bad thing. Maybe they should be written for a public audience, because it would be great if everybody could read kind of the source material for where all of our information comes from. Usually these articles are going to outline the details of an experiment, so they are going to tell you all about the methods and things like that, and they're usually very dry and very boring. Usually pure black and white, just text. There's no celebrities, there's no familiar names, it can be pretty dry and boring. I'm not going to lie. The second best place to find that is going to be in review journal articles. Review journal articles are journal articles that are published in peer-reviewed sources like these journals, but they don't collect their own data. Instead, they will review the body of literature. And so basically it summarizes lots of other previously established and published journal studies, and they are written, again, with other scientists in mind. So sometimes you can find good information in books, and these are a little bit harder to find. It was just chapters in edited books, so you may not come across those too much, but sometimes researchers will, instead of publishing in journals, they'll collect a bunch of individual chapters and put them together in a book. You can get information that way, but it's not usually ideal. It's harder to find information like that. Sometimes you can get it in regular books, I don't know, your favorite scientist just published a book and it's meant for a mainstream audience. That can be a good place to find information too, but usually those books aren't actually peer-reviewed, so other scientists are not required to review that information like they are with these other two, with the empirical journal articles and the review journal articles. And then finally we have full-length books, which is, like psychology books that are not written by psychologists. And at the very best, they can kind of talk about conclusions that people had about journal articles, but usually they will present a bunch of ideas without having a whole lot of great hard evidence for it, which can be dangerous. All right, so if you want to know how to find these articles, you can go to PsycInfo or you can go to Google Scholar. Both of these are free to you as psychology majors, but PsycInfo, I've already put the link to that on Plato, so you've already been there. But PsycInfo is just this massive database maintained by the American Psychological Association, and you can come up with these really, really intricate searches to find. I want to find self-esteem papers published in Europe after the year 1940, but before the year 1962, and it needs to be less than 20 pages long. So you can have some really, really specific searches from PsycInfo, which makes it really powerful. But if you don't want to do that, you can also use Google Scholar. If you type scholar.google.com, you can do that right now. It takes you to a search engine just for peer-reviewed articles, or mostly just for peer-reviewed articles. And you can find a lot of great information there too, and it's also free and easy to do. So usually, me personally, I like going with Google Scholar first and then going with PsycInfo second, once I have a better idea of what I'm looking for. Other professors may tell you just to use PsycInfo, but it's okay to use Google Scholar. Just like it's okay to use Wikipedia. It's okay to use Wikipedia. There's nothing wrong with that. Just be careful about it. Alright, so this is an example of a peer-reviewed research article. So you've probably seen one of these before where they have, here we got the journal name up here, and this information is going to be a little bit different for every journal. Sometimes this info is over on the right-hand corner. But we have Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, published in 1998, so a long time ago. The italics number is the volume number, which is usually referring to the year it's been published. So this journal is in its 5th year, so this journal comes from, as old as 1993. And the issue, which is how many times or which release this is of that year. So this is the 4th issue of 1998, and we can see the page numbers right here, 644, 649. It's only 5 pages long. Awesome. We got the title right here. We got the name right here, and then we have where they did that work below it. So this piece right here is the abstract, and it's kind of like a really short version of a really short summary of the whole article. Chances are you already know this info though. But I want to really quickly go through how to get through these articles and some strategies for what to look for. So journal articles are really hard to read. As I mentioned, they are written with the scientist in mind. And so usually only experts in those specific fields are able to really extract meaningful information from that. And the reason why they are so boring and so dry is because they do that, at least nominally, to reduce bias. So why is that important? Because what if I told you, like, hey, I found that drinking warm coffee makes you rate strangers favorably compared to if you drink cold coffee, then you rate those strangers less favorably. What if I told you, dude, if you take coffee, if you drink something hot, you're going to think everybody around you is also hot, and if you drink something cold, then nobody else around you is hot, right? Like, there, I tried to make it interesting, I tried to make it sound fun and casual, but it requires a lot of follow-up, right? What do you mean hot? What do you mean by that? So usually it's presented in a very dry and boring way to try to reduce the sensationalism, reduce the flowery adjectives that could be used to describe something, because that might bias you reading that. If I tell you that these data are really exciting, then that might bias your reaction to them. Maybe you go into it now thinking that it's more credible than it actually is, or if you're a skeptic, more skeptical than you would be otherwise. Either way, you're introducing bias into the equation, and we want to try to reduce that. It does take a lot of practice. If this does not come naturally to you, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, like, I'm just not good at reading research articles. And that's like saying, like, I'm not good at math if you've only tried math a couple of times. For almost everybody, math takes a lot of practice, right? Or learning a language. Learning English takes a lot of practice. But we get good at it because we practice it and because we're exposed to it. And that's kind of the cornerstone argument for this class, is that we're going to be practicing reading this stuff because it's not easy. It does not come naturally. It's the opposite of how most of our communication is. Most of our communication is meant to be exciting and not dry. So almost all of them are going to have the same kinds of sections. An abstract, an introduction, a method section, a results section, and a discussion section followed by the references. This is nice because, and on one hand, you may look at this and say like, oh, that's really boring. If it's the same format for all of these articles, that's really boring. That's one way to think about it. The way that I think about it is that I see this and I'm like, okay, great. Now I know exactly where the things are that I'm looking for. If I get asked about how many participants were in this study, I know exactly where to find that information. I don't need to find a table of contents. I don't need to look at an index or whatever. I don't need to flip through pages. I know exactly that I can find that in the method section, probably at the very beginning. Usually in the first 2 paragraphs, you're going to find that. All right, so let's talk about what each of these components are. The abstract, as I mentioned, that is going to be a quick summary of what the article is about. Most of them are about 100 to 250 words. So they don't really go into any detail. They give you the big broad picture of the study. The introduction is next, and the introduction is going to give you a lot of background about the research. So it's going to tell you about the theory and the hypotheses that are at play here. And it's going to usually tell you about other people who have found similar things or have found the opposite things or whatever. They try to give you, the reader, all you need to know before you read the rest of this article to understand it. The method section then is going, and in my opinion, the intro is the hardest part of the paper to write. But you don't have to worry about writing that now. You have to write those for your Research Methods 2 course. So the method section is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It is what the researchers did. So how they conducted the study, how many participants did they have, what measures did they use, did they form groups, and if they did, how was groups decided? Everything that you would need to recreate this study, and I mean everything. So I always tell my students whenever they're writing their own method section, imagine that that whoever's doing this, you need them to do it perfectly, and they can't email you. They can't text you to ask you a question. So you need to have every single little detail out in the open for your method section, which also makes it a little bit boring, but it gives you everything that you could possibly need to know. The results section is actually, this is not really where you find the conclusions of the study, which is, I think a lot of people get confused by that. The results section is almost always going to be statistics. It's almost always going to be math. That people are going to use statistical tests to kind of show differences or trends or patterns in their data. And so that's what the results section is for. And then the discussion section, this is where people talk about the main conclusions. This is where people will talk about the big findings, what I think of as the quote-unquote take-home message, and there's usually no math involved. It's just in plain English, here's what happened, here's what we found. And it explains why this stuff is important, how it's connected to the real world, and how it feeds into our growing understanding of that literature or of human behavior. And sometimes it can even, and I think the best papers will do this, is at the end give you maybe some other explanations for, look, maybe we aren't right about this, maybe there's something else that's going on here, and here are some examples of what they might be, or hey, look, this study is not perfect, and here's some ways that we might try to improve it. So the discussion section has a lot going in it. It has a lot going on in it. It gives you the summary of the study. It tells you why it's important, tells you how it's connected to the real world, and it gives you some maybe alternative explanations and other, pointing out the problems and the ways that those problems could be remedied for future researchers. And then finally, the reference section is going to be a list of all the sources that were used for people doing that work. And these things are great because if somebody says, for example, I was using that, that was actually a real study that I was talking about where people hold a hot cup of tea and they rate people around them more favorably. So if somebody says, hey, it's like that, that this is just like that article where if you're holding a hot object, you're more likely to rate somebody else as favorable. You would put a citation there so that I can then go and double check and see, oh, what the heck is that about? And then try to understand that. And this can be great. Think of it as a way of like showing your work, that you cite these sources, so that way you can say like, this is what I'm saying, but this other guy said it too, or this is what she found, and this is what other people found that supported what she found. So that's the references. So how do we read these? Really, it's up to you. So I'm going to say that it's up to you, but I'm going to tell you how I do it. So feel free to try it this way. Feel free to try it, if you want to, starting at the very top and then reading all the way down to the bottom. I don't do it. My attention is not that good, so I get bored, and then I'll start checking my phone if I try to do that. So here are my tips and tricks. So one of the first things to do when you're looking at an article like this is try to find out, what is their hypothesis? What are they trying to test here exactly? You might find that in the abstract, but good chance you're going to find it in the last paragraph of the introduction. Almost always you're going to find it in the last paragraph of the introduction, where they say exactly what the study was and what it intended to do. If you see that, the hypothesis, and then you're thinking about, well, what do they find? Like, what do they find? Do they support the hypothesis, or do they not support it? You can usually find that in the first paragraph of the discussion. The first paragraph of the discussion is usually, and sometimes it's even as simple as the first line of the first paragraph of the discussion, is just going to say, usually in plain English, here's what we found, here's what we concluded. Then after that, usually I would say, go back to the start or go check out the methods. Honestly, for me, I look for the hypothesis. I look for the first paragraph of the discussion, and then I kind of look through the methods a little bit, and then I go to the introduction. So that, and that might sound kind of complicated, but all I mean to say here is that there's not just one simple way to do it. That there's lots of different strategies that you have. And you can see here that I'm making use of these different sections. I know where to find this information because I know what these sections mean and what they're used for. All right. So there are less scholarly places to look for info, such as bookshelves. And, if you go to a bookshelf at a regular bookstore or whatever, a lot of that stuff is not really written for the scientifically minded. It can still be great info, just maybe not. And actually, one second. Sorry, I don't mean to show off my midriff or my shirt or whatever, but I have a really great example of this. So this right here, Proust and the Squid. This is a book that is written for a popular audience. It's not written for the scientifically minded. It is a book about neuroscience, and it is a book about literature, but it is not, it's written very casually. I could give this to my cousin or my mom or dad who are not scientists, and they'd be able to enjoy this. It's written for a public audience. This, on the other hand, the 40 Studies That Change Psychology, you can't really find this on the bookstore at Barnes & Noble because it's kind of like a textbook. It's got a bunch of different chapters that are all kind of written by different people, and it cites a lot of research. It does a really good job of citing things, but this would be more like one of the chapter-edited books that I was talking about earlier. Usually, they're pretty easy to tell which is which. Like, it'll say, edited by so-and-so on this. But, yeah. Anyways, I just looked up and saw those two books that perfectly made this point here. And those books, actually, sorry, one more second. I know I'm trying to keep this video short, but this is just too good a coincidence. So this book, Proust and the Neuroscience and Scientist, I bought these two books because they're very, very similar and about similar things, and I wanted to kind of compare them as I read. But one of the things about this one, which is really interesting, is that this was published, got lots of great reviews when it came out. And it wasn't until a few years later that people realized that this guy, Jonah Lerner, plagiarized a bunch of this stuff. He either made it up or he cited things without attribution. Or he did that in some of his other books too. So anybody can publish that stuff. It can find its way on a bookshelf. It does not need scientists to review it or to check it or to make sure that it makes sense. Anybody can publish it, which is why you have to be a little bit careful. And speaking of anybody can do it, Wikipedia. Wikipedia is great. Anybody can edit it, which is a great thing. but it's also a bad thing because even stupid people can edit it. And I say stupid people, even bad actors can edit it, where people will intentionally put misinformation in innocuous places to try to trick people or change people's minds about things. So Wikipedia can be helpful. I really like Wikipedia, but I would highly recommend that if you use it for any of your classes, that whenever you read something that catches your eye, find that reference that information comes from, track it down at the bottom, and then start there too, and look for that. Newspapers and magazines, sometimes you can find great information here, but always they are we call these secondary resources because they always are going to refer back to the other science articles that we discussed earlier, those peer-reviewed articles. Journalists will read that and they will try to summarize it for a broad audience. So sometimes you can hope that those journalists are experts in that field, but not always. Which means that you have somebody who's not an expert reading an article they barely understand and then trying to dumb it down for a broad audience, because newspapers and magazines write at an 8th grade reading level. I don't know if y'all knew that, but that's just kind of like a stylistic thing. So be very careful whenever you consult these other sources. I'm not saying don't trust them. I'm just saying be skeptical. Think about them. Think when you're reading it. I want everybody to be reading it and thinking like, where is your proof for this? I'm not buying it. Okay, so that's the first half of what we're talking about today. So, reading psychology. I feel like I need a break. So, and I know you probably need a break too. So go ahead and grab a drink. We did that in 30 minutes, which is perfect. We're going to do the next 30 minutes talking about ethics. So let's talk about ethics. Ethics, here's an example. Sometimes I joke in class where, because I teach sensation and perception, for example. Or actually, no, I'll use cognitive psychology. I think maybe that's a little bit more interesting than sensation or perception. So cognitive psychology, sometimes I will joke around in that class and somebody will say like, do we know like what that area of the brain is used for? Maybe they're talking about the insular cortex. And if I don't know, and if people just don't know, because we don't know everything about the brain, sometimes I'll say like, oh, I'll give you extra credit if I can crack open your head and pull that part of your brain out and then see what happens. Then we can understand what it does. And usually like 3 people will laugh because it's not really that funny. But the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes there are research ideas and questions that are not ethical, right? It would be unethical for me to do that. It would be a bad thing. It would be irresponsible of me to do that. Even if that student says, look, I really need extra credit, so I will let you saw my skull open and poke around in there if you can give me extra credit. Why is that unethical, even if I have their consent? Well, because it's coercive. They're doing that so that they can get extra credit. They're doing something that is irrational and irresponsible to try to get extra credit. So, this brings us to the IRB. The IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, is a governing body that most universities and medical centers have that essentially tries to ensure that all research carried on there is ethical and is up to good standards. So, usually these are going to be composed of by scientists, administrators, community members, students, that the makeup of an IRB, who serves on that board, is quite varied. It's meant to be diverse. Why do you think that is? The reason why is to make sure that, if you had a board of just scientists, scientists might think that something is as ethical that maybe the common person outside the common public, in the common public, would see as monstrous or hideous or bad or useless or whatever. That's why it's helpful that it's not just scientists that are on this board, that there's other people like community members. Here at Westfield, I am on the IRB, so I am one of the scientists on that board. But we also have like a local pastor on that board as well. He's not a scientist, he's not an administrator, but he is somebody from the community that we can occasionally ask and say like, hey, does this sound right? Like as somebody who doesn't have expertise in this field. This also exists for non-humans as well. It's called an IACUC. And IACUC is like the IRB for non-human animals. So if you're doing animal research, you can't just kill an animal to see what it does for science. You can't just hurt an animal to see what it does in the name of science. You have to have a good reason, and you have to demonstrate that you're doing this in as painless a way as possible, which is also true for humans too. But I'm only pointing this out to say that anytime we do research, it's going to have some kind of governing body making sure that it's ethical. So why do we have an IRB? Because people cannot be trusted to do research without it, to do research and keep it ethical. In World War II, there was rampant medical experiments done with non-consenting prisoners who were almost always Jewish, where they or even army deserters or Romani people or pretty much anybody who wasn't German or Aryan. So after that, after World War II, basically there were war tribunals and stuff like that, and people wrote up something called the Nuremberg Code, and the Nuremberg Code was a response to this. It was meant to try to make sure that nobody was going to do medical experiments on people who didn't consent to it, make sure that people weren't justifying torture by using medical means and things like that. But I'm not trying to say this is Germany's fault, because here in the United States, we have our own fair share of really horrible things, such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. This was in Alabama, I think from 1930-something or 40-something to 1970. 1970, I think 1972, so this was like probably when your parents were alive, right? Like, this was not ancient history. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, this is where essentially poor black people in Tuskegee, Alabama, would go to a hospital, and if they had symptoms of syphilis, they would be enrolled in this trial where they would say, like, we're monitoring, or we're going to give you these treatments to get rid of your syphilis, or to get rid of your quote-unquote bad blood, and they just monitored them. They didn't actually give them any medication or any useful treatments. They just monitored them to see what would happen to a human body after years of syphilis. So essentially they killed and tortured these people by withholding treatment for them. So, and this was, done by, licensed medical professionals, people that you would expect would know better than to do something like this. So this is why we need the IRB. This is why we need review boards to make sure that we are not doing anything unethical. There are three types of studies, or three types of IRB reviews that I want to talk about. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I should have saved this towards the end. But three different kind of variations of this. The first is the full board review. The full board review is essentially everybody on the board has to review it to make sure that it's ethical. So anytime you use drugs, anytime you ask questions about sensitive topics like sexual assault or drug use or criminal activity or suicide, these really sensitive things, anything that could require legal reporting, like if you ask somebody, have you murdered somebody before? Any of these things require that they has to go through the full board. So everybody has to review it, has to approve of it as ethical before it can actually collect any data. Expedited is basically that you are collecting data, but you're mostly just doing surveys and kind of routine measurements. You're not really doing anything exciting or scandalous or dangerous. So that would be expedited. It does not require everybody on the IRB to read it. And then finally we have exempt. And exempt is essentially like if you use something that is so benign and so safe and easy that you just don't even really need more than one person to approve of it. And usually this is going to be for things like educational tests. So if I wanted to administer the SAT in the classroom, that would be an example of exempt, because the SAT is an educational test. It's been used for years. We know that it doesn't pose a risk to people. So those are the three different types of review. We'll talk about some of these concepts like minimal risk and protected populations. We'll talk about those in just a second. All right, here I made this quick note that the PI can recommend the level of review. Now that I say this out loud, PI stands for Principal Investigator. So it stands for Principal Investigator. They're like the lead person on the experiment. All right, so true or false? And now that I'm thinking about this, if you haven't read the book, some of this is just going to be new information. So I want you to try to, in your head, say true or false, and then I'll give you the answer. So true or false? All research that involves interaction or intervention with humans or human samples / data, whether they are alive or dead, is human subjects research. So does it, I guess what this is saying is, does it matter if the human is alive or dead? It does matter. This is true. So even if you're researching dead people, like dead human subjects, that can also require IRB approval. If I wanted to look at somebody's liver or whatever, I would need to sign off for that. Number 2, if a researcher determines that his or her study poses no more than minimal risk as defined by the federal regulations, there is no need for the protocol to have IRB review and approval. We know that that is false because I just told you so on the last slide. Even if it does have minimal risk, it does require an IRB review. Investigators must obtain informed consent if the study involves interactions, interventions, and or collection of private information from or about research participants. So does it matter? Do they need informed consent? Do you need to tell people and have their consent if you are engaging with their private information? Yes. Yes, you do. After informed consent for a study is given, a participant must complete the study. That is false. So if somebody tells you, yes, I consent to be in your study, that does not give you the right to hold them there prisoner. You actually have the obligation to, if they say like, look, this was way too intense for me, I'm actually going to not do this anymore, that is no big deal. They still, they don't get penalized in any way for that. Children under the age of 18 may give their informed consent in a research study. This is false. At least in in Massachusetts, it depends on the age of consent in that state, which in Connecticut is 18, but in Alabama it's 19. Because I remember when I did research in Alabama, we had we could not have 18-year-olds in our study. So I'm just looking up age of consent in Massachusetts. So. And I don't mean sexual consent, which is what popped up in Google. Maybe it is 16, the age of legal consent here. But in most states it's going to be 18 or 19. Either way, children under, like anybody that's considered a child or a teenager or whatever who's not considered an adult in Massachusetts is unable, and this is actually really going to bother me now. I need to find legal age of adult in Massachusetts. Yeah, it is 18. Sorry. I psyched myself out. That's what I get for Googling the wrong thing. The age of legal consent is 18 in Massachusetts. That's whenever you became an adult. And so if you are not an adult, you cannot legally participate, you cannot legally give your informed consent for that. You would have to have your parents provide that consent for you. Number 6, risk to participants must be completely eliminated for the study to be considered ethical. That is false. You don't need risk to be totally eliminated. Some studies carry some amount of risk. One of the students in my lab, she was researching violent images and how they affect people with anxiety. And so showing someone a violent image is a risk. It is a risky thing to do because somebody's day might get ruined. They may be triggered by some experience, or it may put them in a really bad mood, or I think it was the first thing that I said. They may relive some trauma or whatever. And those are things that are risky. They are dangerous. And so that was a study that we did our best to make it as ethical as possible. but it did carry a risk. We just had to let participants know ahead of time what they were in for, and to remind them they could withdraw from the study anytime if they chose. And finally, confidentiality of data must be maintained for the study to receive IRB approval. So does it need to be confidential in order for it to receive IRB approval? This one is really tricky. In almost every case, the answer is true. But in this case, it's false. You don't have to have it to be confidential in very special cases. But for the most part, I would say 99 times out of 100, you do need to have it confidential. All right, so I talked a lot about consent. What does consent really mean? In research, consent has a very specific meaning and context. Usually I feel like when people talk about consent, they usually are talking about it usually in terms of like taking advantage of people, or even to have it be sexually related in some way. But in research, informed consent is like you giving the participant everything they need to know to make an informed decision about whether they should or should not participate in a study. So what does it mean for it to be informed consent? What do you need to tell the participant? You should tell them about the purpose of the research. So you should tell them what the research is for. You should tell them what procedures you're going to be doing in that research. You should let them know if they decide not to do the research, what alternatives do they have? Does that mean that they can just go home, no big deal? Or does it mean that there's an alternative study that they can do? You need to let them know that every potential risk and discomfort should be reduced as much as possible or eliminated, and that includes physical injury, but also includes psychological injury. So like if you're showing somebody violent images, you need to ensure them that they're going to be, that you reduced the total discomfort and risk as much as possible without sacrificing the integrity of the study. So any possible way that somebody could be at risk financially, socially, that they need to know about those risks. They also need to know the potential benefits of the research. So if this is research that might go on to help people with autism spectrum disorder, then maybe that you let them know that. Or if this could go on to be used to create a powerful medicine to help people with schizophrenia, then you would want to let them know what the benefits are. You would also want to let them know roughly how long it takes for them to participate. So they need to know reasonably, like this is going to take an hour. You don't want to just tell them, oh, yeah, I don't know, it depends, because they need to know as much as possible, like I said, in order to give an informed decision about whether they choose to participate in this experiment or not. Payment for participation, so if they are going to be funded with money or with extra credit or whatever, you would want to let them know that. You would also want to remind them that this is voluntary. This is very similar to what I was talking about in terms of alternatives to the study, but to let them know that this research is voluntary and that they can discontinue at any time and that it's not a big deal. And to let them know about their right to confidentiality and that they can withdraw at any time. So we're not going to tell on them because they withdrew. And then finally, the contact info for usually the researcher and the chair of the IRB in case anybody has any concerns or questions. All right, so I talked a little bit about anonymity and confidentiality. So anonymity, those things often sound the same, I feel like. They sound really related. So I wanted to take a step and just make sure that we're on the same page about what each of them mean. So anonymity, this is essentially you are ensuring that subjects are not going to have any record of their identity stashed away with their data. So if you're doing, and so you can easily imagine why this might be important. If you are asking somebody about criminal behavior, like drug use or something like that, you'd want to ensure anonymity so that way, let's say you leave the filing cabinet open, that somebody can't just reach in there and then learn all these dark secrets about people, right? So you want to make sure that it's anonymous, that whenever somebody's taking a study or taking a survey, that their names, that any kind of identifiable information is not connected to their data. So that way you can't, learn all this private stuff about somebody's identity. Then we have confidentiality. Confidentiality is protecting someone's privacy and the ways in which you can go to do that. So this would be like, so if something's confidential, it basically means that it's really, really hard for somebody to get access to it. Anonymity means that you can't know it because they're anonymous. The identities have been erased. Whereas confidentiality would be like that I have. So, and the reason why this comes up, why would you need data that's not confidential? This is a really heavy, I'm going to give you a really heavy example for a second. So, especially if you are triggered by thoughts of suicide and things like that, I'm going to talk about that for a second. If you're doing trauma research or suicide research, it can sometimes be necessary that your study is not anonymous. And so, if somebody were to say on a survey that I plan to commit suicide by the end of the year, the researcher has the right to reach out to that individual to try to provide counseling, clinical psychology services, or whatever, any means necessary to protect that person's life, to make sure they're safe. So, if that data is anonymous, you can't do that, right? So sometimes your data can't be anonymous. And that's whenever you have really sensitive questions like this, where somebody's life might be at stake. Or if you have a study where you absolutely have to be able to follow up with somebody about their data, then it might not be anonymous as well. But for the most part, you try to make it anonymous when possible. But confidentiality, that's going to be the way in which you can protect those identities. So you can keep it separate from the data that's gathered. So you can keep it like totally separate from that. You can code it so that, when you're looking at it, it looks like, like A, B, C, and D, where A, B, and C, and D mean specific things. They're just set in a different file. And locking up lists, and this means both digitally and physically, and then even destroying the list whenever you're done with the research. These are all things that are common practice in research. What does the IRB look for whenever they're judging whether or not something's ethical? They look for whether or not the risks have been minimized. They look for whether or not the risks that are there are reasonable, considering how much benefits could come from this research. They would look for whether or not the participants that were chosen for that study were relatively balanced, or does it seem like they largely favor, people who are rich, or people who have less than 100 IQ or whatever. They're looking to make sure that you're giving out informed consent, that you are making sure that people know what they're getting into, that you're documenting that, and that you are keeping the data safe and confidential, and when possible, making it anonymous. And that vulnerable participants will be safeguarded. Vulnerable here, this is what I mean by protected population. A vulnerable participant could be kids, for example. They also could be people with developmental disabilities. They could be prisoners. They could be pregnant mothers. Anybody who presents circumstances that require a little bit more attention. That is what we mean by vulnerable participant. All right, so to wrap all this up, here are 6 questions to be thinking about whenever you're designing your own research. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I think I gave a pretty good, you can read this and be pretty good about it. And I'm just saying that because I got my eye on the time and I know that we're getting close to that hour. So the first question to ask yourself is your research design valid? So you want to test the effects of social media on anxiety. Are you even using the right research design? Are that is actually an ethical question. Why is it ethical? Because we don't want our study to be unnecessary. If our study is unnecessary, then that means that any harm caused from that study is also unnecessary too. So, for example, if you're doing a study where you're looking at, so the example that I gave about the student that was working in my lab, where she was looking at violent images in people with anxiety, if that study had already been done, or if we weren't going to have good, clear conclusions from that, then we shouldn't do it, because it could potentially be harmful for people, right? It could trigger their anxiety or whatever. So it's important to pay attention to whether or not your research design is valid. Is the researcher involved competent? Is the person actually doing this research able to do it? You have to consider that whenever you're doing research, that you can't be unrealistic, or you can't assume that a high school junior is able to pull off a really elaborate research project, because again, that might introduce harm if that researcher is not totally prepared for it. Do you know the consequences of your research? So are you sure that you're exposing someone to minimal risk, where minimal risk means that it's no more risk than what people would normally encounter in their everyday life. So minimal risk is essentially not saying that there's no risk. Minimal risk is saying that the risk that you are going to experience in the study is no different than if you were to just turn on the TV or to go outside. That is minimal risk. So you want to make sure that you are trying to reach that point of minimal risk when possible. Are participants chosen appropriately? Is there any kind of bias to the way that you are choosing participants? So for example, if I was doing that study, let's say social media and anxiety, if they're connected, and I was only asking college students about that, and then I tried to claim that this was true for everybody, you can easily imagine why that would be unethical, because I'm only researching this one sliver of the population. I shouldn't assume that it generalizes to everyone. And you can see how this could mean that people are, in psychology, one of the things that we see, sorry, my dog is barking, it's driving me crazy. One of the things that you'll see as we read a lot of these articles is that if you look at the participant breakdown, you're going to usually find more women than men in the participant pool. Why? Because in terms of psychology majors, there's usually more women than there are men, which means that the people who participate in this research generally are women too, which is why you might find an article that has 80% of the participants were women. So one of the things you want to make sure is that you are choosing your participants carefully so that you don't have kind of lopsided participant pools. And that's something you can be looking for whenever you're reading these articles too. And you want to make sure that participants know their rights, so you want to make sure they get informed consent, and I already talked about that. You want to have a backup idea for if somebody gets injured. So if you're doing something where you're studying anxiety, then you want to know, okay, here's the best way that I can get a hold of, counseling services, or a clinical psychologist or a therapist that we have on hand who's prepared to help in cases like this. If you decide to use deception, so if you're going to be lying to your participants about something, which can be possible, you want to make sure that the deception it is going to reduce the risk as much as possible. And again, that you're doing it as ethically as possible. Now, when would you use deception ethically? That doesn't sound right. Let's say that I'm looking at there's a really great study that looks at what kinds of people are likely to hold the door open for others. And if you knew that you were in a study where somebody was monitoring to see if you opened the door for somebody, would that change your behavior? Absolutely it would. If that were the case, then you would want to see it. You can hear my wife talking to the dogs. If that's possible, then you want to make sure that that participant doesn't know that they're being monitored to see if they're going to do a good deed, because you know that if they know they're being watched, it's going to change how they behave. This leads us to debriefing, which is essentially letting the participant know everything after the study, that if you did deceive them in some way, that you come forward about it. And that's it. And then I have a couple of examples back here. But hey, we finished in an hour, which is awesome. Now I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to go get my dog, because I promised you that if you made it to the end that I'll show him to you. So here we go. 1 second. Okay, so I have my dog Teddy here. He is... he's getting older. He has some pretty bad arthritis, so it's harder for him to get around. So usually, if there's some heavy stairs or whatever, I'll give him a lift. I'll help him out sometimes. But yeah, he has been with me since before I was a doctor. That's how old he is. So he's been around for a while. He's very good, but he doesn't really like the limelight. He doesn't like the spotlight. He prefers silence, and he prefers usually calmness. Which sometimes he and the puppy that you saw in the previous chapter can sometimes not always get along. Teddy likes to bark at them. You got anything to say, Teddy? You want to tell those young researchers out there that you're excited to work with them in Chapter 4 or something? I don't know. All right. Thanks, bud. All right. Yeah, he looked real excited to be here, right? Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will see you later in Chapter 4.